if you have a farm or ranch, it's probably worth a decent amount of money. And I would highly recommend at least having a conversation with, your CPA and an attorney to look at a trust to make sure that your goals are in writing to where you know that, hey, those are going to be there. And what you want to have happen is going to happen.
Welcome to Leaders of the West, a podcast for innovators and changemakers. I'm your host, Jessie Jarvis, the founder of the West, and I'm sitting down with agriculturalists, entrepreneurs, executives, and everyone in between with the goal of digging into the strategies, mindsets, and lessons that have been crucial to the success of ag and Western. Whether you're carrying on the next generation of your family's operation, starting something from scratch, or determined to climb up the leadership ladder, we're going to inspire you to continue to dream big, growing not just you, but the future of agriculture and Western as a whole. Let's go. Justin, we are here for another episode, our bonus episodes. And this is definitely financial related, but it is what I would call like finance adjacent, if you will. So maybe a month ago, we asked people to basically send in their questions that they wanted to have us answer. And we received, holy cow, we could probably do a year's worth of bonus episodes just based off the questions that we received. There were so many of them and they were so good. And it was kind of hard for us to pick what we wanted to talk about because we wanted to group them to where they all kind of made sense and fit together. But one of the most common topics that we got questions on was farm and ranch succession planning. So that is what we're going to chat about today. And these are questions that our listeners have asked us. So Justin is going to answer them for you guys. I'm going to chat a little bit because obviously this is something that my husband and I are also involved in now in our daily lives. That's not to say if you asked a question and you got on here hoping that we were going to answer it and it wasn't about farm and ranch succession, that we won't answer it in the future because, like I said, we received so many of those questions and we hope to continue to do this Q&A. But that's what we've got on tap for today. So all of these questions, they came from a variety of our listeners. Again, they all are kind of around the same topic. Justin, do you have anything to add before we get into it?
No, I mean, it definitely comes up a lot. There's different reasons why I think farm succession planning or ranch succession planning does. One thing that I found interesting that and I think a lot of people in the Western industry kind of are concerned about this when you hear about or read the headlines about like people like Bill Gates and these big corporations and people that are buying up all this farmland. And I didn't realize the largest owner of farmland in the United States owns, I think it's 0.002%, which is way less than what I thought it was going to be. And that was a little bit of relief because I think, like most people listening, we want the land and our food and production of that to stay in the hands of good farming people. So yeah, it's definitely a hot topic. There's obviously tax issues that we'll get into that are coming up at the end of this year, but I think that's why it's such a hot topic. And of course, with baby boomers, a lot of them being, over 65, that's obviously coming into play as well.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think that it's a hot topic for a couple of reasons. One, because we also come from a generation where we don't necessarily talk about money or finances, and we don't necessarily talk about the details of our business. And there are parts of that I really, really like. Like, I don't necessarily think that those are things that we talk about at the dinner table. Like, I was raised in an era where you didn't talk about politics, and now look at America. But at the same time, I think that if we were able to have more of those conversations and it was more of an open topic, then we'd be able to have a lot more constructive conversations and we'd be able to do better as an industry versus, well, this is what I'm doing because it makes sense to me. I don't know what my neighbors are doing. I don't know what anybody else is doing. And you kind of feel like you're on your own island in that sense when you're making these decisions, kind of setting it up for the next generation. And two, that I think is very important in that topic is what you were faced with as a generation. Like thinking of my dad, for instance, what he was faced with for most of his career is far different now than what my husband and I are going to be faced with for the bulk majority of years in our career. And it's honestly like apples and oranges. And so I feel like it's kind of unfair to place blame on any one generation because there's no way for them to know what you will be going through in the future. Nobody has a crystal ball because what they went through in the past is so different in that dynamic.
Yeah, it's definitely different. And the great thing about the Western industry is, and we all know the type, I met more multimillionaires from the Western industry that if you want to find that out about them, you're going to have to pry it out of them. They're just not going to tell you, you know? So that's the great thing about it. But people need to realize if we want to keep it that way, then when it comes to the internal family, yes, it is something that needs to be talked about.
Absolutely. So on the topic of succession planning as a whole, any other thoughts? I mean, we talked about like why it is such a hot topic. Anything else you want to add to that before we get started into some of these questions?
Yeah, I mean, just realizing, and a lot of people fall in this category, 97% of the farms in the U.S. are owned by families. And that is an awesome, awesome thing. We want to keep it that way. And they've done surveys and studies and passed it out in census, et cetera. And over 70%, I mean, their plan is, hey, we're going to leave this down to kids, grandkids, heirs, whoever that may be, et cetera. But out of those that all plan on leaving it down, only 23% when asked the question if there was a succession or estate plan in place, only 23% said, yes, we have one in place right now. And so you magnify that, you take all the farmland in the United States and ranch land, 97% owned by families. Well, if we're talking about less than a third that actually have a plan to make sure that stays in the family, that's not good. And I think that's why it hits such a hot button for a lot of people is deep down, they're like, we're humble. We don't want to talk about it, but we know we need to. So hopefully after this, people will say, you know what? Yeah, let's go and have that conversation.
Well, I think let's kick it off in a great place, which is how does somebody get started?
Yeah. And getting started, and of course, each family dynamic is going to be completely different. That is just fine. But in general, the best place I think to start, that what we've seen that come down the pike and it goes smooth, is when mom and dad or whoever owns the farm or the ranch right now, they talk amongst themselves and put themselves priority number one. They're the ones running it, earned it, held on to it, etc. And so they need to make sure that their goals, theirs and theirs only, are clear. What do they need? What are their desires? Who do they want to go down to? Which kids, heirs, charities, churches, whatever it may be, and get that really clear, because as we all know, mom and dad's goals may be completely different than what the kids' goals are. And that's just fine. It's theirs, not the kids. And I'm in the same boat. I mean, my mom owns, dad's passed, but mom still owns a small ranch down in Arkansas. And it's her decision first. It's not up to me. And so once they get that identified, then go down to having that communication with the kids, because that's where all kinds of different dynamics, especially these days, can come into play, where maybe you got 3 or 4 kids, maybe you got 2, maybe they all want to be involved, maybe only 1 or 2 wants to be involved. Maybe you got one that's living there working it right now, and you got another one that doesn't want anything to do with it. So that creates its own set of things to be figured out right there whenever, okay, we want to leave it down to our kids, but they're on 2 different islands over here. And so having those communications, and really just the place to start is get it up front. Honestly, what does mom and dad want? Number one, where are their needs? Number one, are they going to be taken care of? If they're done working it, want to retire, what are their needs? Making sure they're taken care of, and then identify where the kids at, how much involved they want to be. And once you get those things clarified and everything's out in the open as a family, then you can move on to talking to professionals and taking it to the next step.
Oh, absolutely. I echo that. And the other thing that I will say too, coming from my personal perspective, it can be really hard to have those conversations. So I'm an only child. And a lot of people who are listening to that are like, well, Jesse, you have the best plan ever. You don't have to split it with anybody or share it with anybody. And, yeah, that may be true. However, I can tell you that when I first asked my parents, like, hey, what is our plan? That was a very difficult question for me to even ask because it can come off very selfish. Depending on how I ask and, what the mood is that day, like, well, is Jessie just asking this because she wants to have everything and she's doing so out of a selfish nature? No, absolutely not. I have my own family that I am raising and I want to protect, and I need to be able to plan and budget to see, what is my entry point and am I going to be able to even afford this? Like, I have to do just as much planning to set myself up for the opportunity as the other family does in needing to pass it on. So I can say, as somebody who has had to have those uncomfortable conversations, and we still continue to have them, and to be frank, I don't like to have them. I think if you had siblings and you all come together and you say, hey, what's the plan? It comes off a lot easier than it does when you are the only person and it looks like you only have selfish interests. But again, that's obviously not the case. So we all know conversations that are worth having never come easy. And I think that many of us, that is the stopping point for us. We don't even try to have the conversation because it makes us so uncomfortable. So if I can encourage you to do one thing out of today, get uncomfortable and be willing to just start that conversation.
I'm going to expand on that just a second. And I would argue that while I agree with 100% of what you just said, and I've been in your shoes too, but what I hear the most and what I think most people will agree with is if you're going to do anything good, you have to get out of your comfort zone. And this is one of those things. And whenever people do get out of their comfort zone, they go and they have the conversation. I think what most people will find is while it's uncomfortable, once that conversation's over and they've got it out in the open, that everybody feels better about it. And they're like,
yes,
why in the world did we wait to do this? Why didn't we do this 5 years ago? Like, that wasn't that bad. Like, now we know where everybody's at. We all feel comfortable. We feel better about this farm or ranch that we've been blessed with. And at the end of the day, if anybody owns a farm or ranch, we've been blessed. And so just look at it as being a good steward of it. God bless us with it. Let's make sure and do the things necessary to keep it and continue to be a good steward of it. And that's what comes out of the conversation. So if people just have that mentality of it, it makes that conversation a whole lot easier.
I agree wholeheartedly. Okay, so what if a plan is not in place? If somebody is listening to this right now and they know that their operation, be it farm or ranch, doesn't have any kind of estate plan or succession plan, what exactly is at stake?
Okay. I kind of feel like we went from a really good, positive, like feel good point to like the worst point of the whole conversation, which is if we don't have a plan in place, we're going to the bottom of the roller coaster. If we don't have a plan in place, that means that what is called intestacy laws will kick in, and it varies by state. But in a nutshell, in layman terms, if you haven't figured out what you want to have done with your estate, the government's going to come in and figure it out for you. And there's not just a ton of things that I'm convinced the government does really good. So if you don't want that happening, that's the worst case scenario. They will figure it out for you. And different states have different laws as far as, well, we're going to look at surviving spouse, then the kids, and we're going to decide what percentage goes to what and who. And that may not align whatsoever with what mom and dad or the original owners had in mind. And so that's the worst case scenario. So I encourage people, let's just have the conversations, go back to the top of the roller coaster. Let's have the feel good conversations, be good stewards, and try to do what we want to have done with it. Because at the end of the day, it's our farms and ranchers that have been worked for. Let's be the ones to decide what to do with it.
So the next question that I have kind of following that is, and obviously we know that every plan for every operation out there looks different. They are as unique as the operations that they apply to. But what exactly are the documents that somebody needs? Is it enough to sit down and build your plan and then write it into your will and go through that process? Does it need to be a separate set of documents? For those who they've heard about estate planning or succession planning and that's all they've ever done with it, and we're encouraging them to have this conversation and to kind of build a plan, what exactly does the plan itself look like?
And I don't want to go too deep into this topic because it can vary so much based on the needs and the family dynamic.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, but in general, you're going to have, a lot of people may have a will, but a will, you can't get very specific as to what you want to have happen with your stuff. Versus a trust, you can be as specific as you want. I mean, down to the details of, and I'm going to use a simple example, money left over in savings, let's say. Really simple example. I mean, you can decide if a grandkid gets it, how much, at what age, under what circumstances, did they have a clean criminal record and graduate high school and college, did they get married? You can name all these instances or things, specifics as to when they get what, and actually put guidelines in that they have to do certain things, otherwise they don't get it. And so a trust really gives a lot of control for, as I say, the mom and dad that earned it, that have it, that were diligent in keeping these assets in the family and in the estate. It gives them full control. And so generally speaking, if you have a farm or ranch, it's probably worth a decent amount of money. And I would highly recommend at least having a conversation with, your CPA and an attorney to look at a trust to make sure that your goals are in writing to where you know that, hey, those are going to be there. And what you want to have happen is going to happen.
Okay. And this may be a question kind of stemming off of that may be better fit for an attorney. However, I know a lot of people hear the word trust and they think, oh, well, once you put it in a trust, then it's really hard to change it. And they've heard kind of the negatives of trusts, if you will. Obviously, we know that's not necessarily the case. Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Yes. And while I'm not an attorney, a trust, while it gives you so much flexibility as far as how much detail you can go into, there's irrevocable trust and revocable trust. The way the vast majority of people that have a trust in their estate plan that utilize a trust, they will review it every 3 to 5 years. And the best thing that they can do is say, okay, get that trust set up and planned for if something happened right now for my assets, my farm, my land, my house, my savings, my equipment, my cattle, my crops, whatever it may be. If something happened this year, this is how I want to have it handled. But as we know, that will change. The net worth can grow. It can decline. The family dynamics can change. People get married. People bring in other spouses into the family. So it's going to change. Just know that having a revocable trust, you can always change it. Plan on changing it as things change. And once you get it set is the hard part, figuring out that initial trust. But once that's done, it's really just going back in every 2, 3, 5 years or as needed and updating that trust, reviewing it for any change that may have occurred and keeping it to make sure it aligns with what you want to have happen. And as long as you do that, then I think when your head hits pillow, people out there are going to be like, all right, I know I've taken care of everything.
I think that's awesome advice. And so we talked a lot about what we would consider to be like ownership, succession, and obviously estate planning. Somebody asked the question about what is the difference between ownership and management succession. I think this is an awesome question, so I'm super excited to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so ownership is obviously, well, who owns a thing? And to your point earlier, if we go back 50 years, most people that own farms and ranches were working them themselves. But you fast forward now, the world's spinning faster than it used to, regardless of what science says, right? And a lot of people now, they may, well, like my cousin, he owns a very successful construction company and he's so busy with that, but he has a lot of land and cattle too, but he has a ranch manager for that. And so I'm using him as an example. I'm not sure exactly what his plans are because it's none of my business. So I've never asked him and I never will. But the guy that's running it for him, I would not be surprised if he wasn't in his will or trust in there somewhere as continuing as a ranch manager for that, because if he leaves that down to kids that may want to continue their careers, he knows that, hey, I got somebody in place that we can trust. So let's have him in there as that management succession. And I've even heard some people that if something were to happen, that person they have in there as management that they want to stay on board. I mean, they give them reasons to stay on. And so who's running it versus who owns it, there's a lot more of that being divided now than there was 50 years ago. And so that's just another thing to look into when you're setting up your estate plan for your farm or ranch is, again, get that communication out there with your kids. Is there a kid already that's willing to run it, management, and taking the helm already? You really don't have much management succession to worry about. But if you don't, maybe the kids want to own it, but they have good careers too. And so they want that place to bring your grandkids back to, et cetera. So you want to stay with them, but they're not going to be the ones running it. So those conversations need to be had. Who is going to run it? Let's talk about that.
Well, and to another scenario, and that is if you are a young couple and you have young kids and you've built something, but they are obviously at 7 and 9 or whatever their ages are, they're not going to be able to run anything. So what is the management plan to then keep it whole until they're old enough to decide if that's something that they are interested in or want, or maybe they want to keep it around, but they want to go off and pursue their own careers and then come back? That's a very realistic situation and scenario as well.
That's a great point. You just keep going. You can do my part.
Hardly.
That's a very awesome point, though. It's a very important point, too.
Next question we got was explain the federal exemption amount and how that can change with each administration. This is another awesome question because obviously we know that just about every 4 years when we change sides from Republican to Democrat, everything that our government is founded on and built on changes with it too. So it's really hard to keep up with all of those changes. That's why we hire financial planners and accountants and lawyers who are up to date on all of those changes so that we, normal man, low man on the totem pole, doesn't have to be as up to date on all of that stuff. But obviously a lot is going to be changing now that we have a newly elected president.
Yeah, this is another fun point to go over. So the federal exemption amount currently for 2025 is $13.99 million per person. So if you're a couple, you're looking at almost $28 million. So what that means is, and it's what we call a step up in basis. So let's say that a farm or ranch that's worth $3 million. If you leave that down to heirs, kids, etc., they're going to get a step up in basis to where, say you bought that for $1 million and now it's worth $2 million. Well, your kids that you leave it down to, their step up in basis means at $2 million, they don't owe any taxes on those gains because their basis is what they inherited it for, the value at the time they inherited it. Okay. So you have to be over that large amount, that 13.99, before you're getting charged the estate taxes. So a lot of people are like, well, that's such a big number that most people, I don't have to worry about it. Here's one thing that people need to be aware of. That is true right now. But not to get into politics, but luckily Kamala didn't get in. But if she had, she was actually proposing that they lower that down to 3.5 million or 3.55 or some really low number. She's wanting to lower it back down. And so think about that for a minute. Think about the number of farms out there that would have brought in, especially with what real estate values have done the last 5-6 years, especially if you go back since 2008 and fast forward till now, what values have done. How many people would that have brought into the fold that were paying estate taxes if they lowered it back down to 3.5 million?
Well, even my face when you said 13 million is a large number. Yes, it is, especially when you are somebody who is first generation and you are trying to get into the business. It is a daunting number. But when you have something, especially if you think about real estate and equipment and a cow herd and a horse herd, because we know how expensive horses are these days, and all of the infrastructure that goes into that, you don't have to have a large operation to be reaching that 13 million mark.
Yeah. And again, to your point, and I don't think we have to worry about it with Trump, but what if somebody else gets in there afterwards, 4 years from now, and they lower it back down?
4 years from now, it could be a very different story.
Yeah. And the good Lord calls you under the wrong president or wrong administration, all of a sudden that's a big, big difference. And so that's where, even though under whatever the laws are now, you may not think you have to worry about estate taxes, but there's always that planning and watching, which if you have a good estate planning attorney or CPA, they keep an eye on this stuff. And they will do a very good job of coordinating their efforts to make sure they keep flexibility in your estate plan to where if that does change, how can we pivot to change with it and mitigate that as much as we possibly can?
So, kind of related to that, a follow-up question that somebody asked, which we really couldn't have planned these questions any better because we got some great ones. So, how can you combat the high valuation of a farmer ranch? Let's say that you're over that $13 million mark.
That's where on a 20-minute podcast, it's hard to get too deep into the weeds on that.
Well, we're already 30 minutes in on a 20-minute podcast. We're notorious for this.
Oh, God, I'm sorry. Didn't seem like we've been talking 30 minutes. It's such an important topic, though, right?
No, I love it. Let's keep going.
Okay, so I'll be quick. When it comes to that, that's where an estate planning attorney, a CPA, you may bring in somebody with, like me, if investment or financial planner, insurance agent. There's a lot of different strategies that sometimes you may have 4 or 5 different professionals working with you on it. But that's where they can get into things and start utilizing, gifting to avoid taxes. You can start and devalue the value of your estate, whether it be gifting, like if you got assets that are going to go down to kids anyway, start using gifting, get it down to them ahead of time. There's a lot of folks that are, if mom and dad retire and they know they got kids or they're already working and running the ranch, owner finance it to them. That way, rather than the kids taking a loan from the banks, now they're paying the bank all this interest. And then mom and dad get a big lump sum, which is great. But at the same time, if they sell it, they have to pay all those capital gains taxes if they've owned the ranch or farm for 20, 30, 40 years. So instead, they'll owner finance it to where they're getting a little bit each year. They got their income taken care of. They're not paying all these capital gains taxes because they're getting smaller amounts per year. And then the kids are getting a great option when it comes to probably a pretty favorable loan. I've got a friend and client that's doing that right now with his dad and his real estate rental portfolio, letting him buy in at a discounted rate, and he's working for him. He's like, I'd rather pay you than anybody else because I can trust you. And it's working out great. There's other family LLCs and other business structures that can be utilized that can help. I hate the terminology, but playing the shell game to mitigate that and lower the value and do things in different ways that keeps it off of the value whenever it does get passed down. And so those are the strategies that, number one, kind of like what we started with, make sure mom and dad had their goals figured out first. In a perfect world, if we could have whatever we wanted out of this, what does that look like? Start with the best you can think of. Knowing you're probably not going to get everything you want, but start with the best you can think of in a perfect world. Then work your way down to the kids. And once all those things are identified throughout the family, without somebody like me or without your CPA or attorney around, have those conversations together. That way it's laid back, it's relaxed. It may be conversations held over time. But once those are somewhat identified out in the open, then bring in the professionals, and they're the ones that will get into the weeds and help you identify the best strategies for your family, your farm, your ranch, to make sure that, like I said, that 97% of the farm and ranch land that's owned by families stays there.
Well, I think that is really the perfect way to get to the last question, which is, what does the process look like if somebody is really actually to start estate planning, succession planning? You mentioned a few of the people that somebody may need to be involved, but who do they start with? Where do they go?
I would start with, like I just mentioned, start with the conversations first, identifying the goals, and then probably start with an estate planning attorney, because they're going to be the ones that are writing up the documents to put that in place. And they will guide you and to kind of take stress off of this process. For anybody out there listening that's It's been on your mind for a while. You're ready to get going. You know you need to. Don't stress out about it. Have the conversations, get an estate planning attorney, or even your CPA, because either one of those can help guide you through those conversations, and they will tell you what other professionals need to be involved depending on your situation. And they will leverage what is outside of their scope of expertise. And so you don't even have to really make those decisions. They're going to tell you, hey, we need to bring in a CPA over here. We may need an insurance agent over here. We may need an investment advisor over here for the investment piece of it. They'll tell you who you need and kind of lead you down that path and guide you through it. Now, time-wise, it may take a couple months. It may take a couple years. It depends on how fast you want to move, how complex your situation is. But it's never anything that, hey, we're going to meet with a professional on Thursday. We better have all this squared away by Wednesday night. It's not like that. So don't stress. Have the conversations, get the ball rolling. They'll walk you through it.
Well, and the other thing that I want to mention on that as well is those expenses, because it is expensive. It is not something that is cheap because you are using professionals, and obviously they have put a lot of time and effort and skill into the craft that they have, but those are all write-offs. So if you are somebody who is thinking, man, I don't know that we can afford to spend this amount of money, but you're also the same person who at the end of the year is looking for ways to spend your money so that you don't have to write a big fat check to Uncle Sam, like, that is a great way to kind of invest that in your future versus buying something that is going to depreciate as soon as you drive it off the lot.
That is a great point. And to expand one more little nugget on there is, if you don't spend the money to do it, what the government charges to do it for you is going to be way more expensive than what hiring a professional that's in your corner is going to charge you. I can promise you that.
And again, you don't want the government making those decisions for you. You want to make them yourself.
Correct. Government's great at spending money. So let them stick to that, and let's get our own professionals for our own stuff.
Yeah, they're great at spending money and taking ours. And I'm probably going to get audited now.
We love the government. What are you talking about?
Oh, I love Uncle Sam. Okay. Well, Justin, any other things that you want to mention on this topic?
I think we covered it. Don't get me started. I'll just keep rolling. We'll be here for an hour. So I'll zip it.
Thank you guys so much for listening to today's episode. I tell you what, this is definitely one that is an important share. So please do us a favor. If you know of people who are kind of in this boat, who maybe need to get pushed in the right direction, this is a great episode to send them to hopefully kind of ease their mind. It is not a painful process. You just have to get started. You have to get a little uncomfortable in first starting out those conversations, but they're not bad once you have them, and you will only be able to move forward from there. So with that, you guys, we will be back for another bonus episode, but thank you so much for listening. You can catch us back here next week with a brand new episode of Leaders of the West. Until then, we'll see you later.
If you loved this episode, do us a favor and share it with someone else who might find just as much value in it as you did. We're on a mission to continue to grow and strengthen the future of agriculture and Western industries, and you spreading the word helps us make more of a positive impact. It also makes a big difference when you take a minute to go rate and review the show. We can't thank you enough for listening, for sharing, and for loving Ag and Western as much as we do. We'll see you back here for our next episode.